Daydreamer. Written by P.J. Chavez. Chapter 1. A fierce storm was working its way across the city of New Chicago. Felix Ryder Falcon had just trekked his way down 8 floors of stairs. Most employees at the Genetics corporate building preferred to take the elevator. Ryder didn't care much for the small talk had there, and enjoyed the few moments alone. He was given 20 minutes every 4 hours to take a break from his monotonous workflow. Approaching the glass doors on the backside of the tall building, Ryder saw a group of Japanese businessmen heading inside from the rain. The doors slid open, disappearing into the walls next to him. These men didn't seem to notice Ryder as they walked by, talking in a language that he did not understand nor care to. Business lingo. Pressed against a small edge of the building that provided shelter from the gust of wind, Ryder pulled a small pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket. With the press of a button, a small laser lit the edge of the cigarette as he inhaled deeply. Not too many people smoked cigarettes in this day and age. They all had special devices that gave them their fix, and didn't require paper or tobacco. It was just a few minutes past 6 o'clock, and the last shift for the night was coming up. Ryder threw the cigarette butt into a passing street cleaner, a small robotic unit that traveled along the streets and sidewalks, picking up trash after all of the lazy assholes and bums in the area. As Ryder walked back into the building and towards the stairs, he noticed something glimmering on the tiled floor below him. It was a data card, a small flat stick capable of storing roughly 8 zettabytes of information. He had not seen anyone else enter or leave the building in the last few minutes. One of the businessmen must have accidentally dropped it. He stashed the data card inside the pack of cigarettes in his breast pocket and started climbing back up the stairs. It was time to get back to work. Later on that night, after the rain had passed, Ryder found himself in the back of a drifter, an automated driverless vehicle that would pick you up and take you anywhere you needed to go for the right amount of credits. The neon-lit streets were packed. It was a Friday. Heading downtown, the drifter began gaining speed and was soon traveling at nearly 200 kilometers an hour. Despite its speed, modern vehicles were very rarely involved in accidents anymore. When Ryder was a child in the early 2000s, nearly 1.3 million people died in automobile accidents each year. As artificial intelligence blossomed, that number had dropped significantly in the last few decades. The rise of AI had changed nearly every aspect of society in one way or another. 2 other people were sitting inside of the drifter with Ryder. He had never met either of them, and quite frankly did not care to. A young-looking woman with straightened purple hair sat across from him. Their eyes locked for a moment, and she seemed to give a shy smile. Ryder smiled back, but quickly shifted his gaze out through the window next to him. New Chicago was a heavily populated and rather large city. It was built on top of the remaining infrastructure of the former city of Chicago. Everything from the Cubs Stadium to the mirror-like art down by the docks was buried below. The city of the past had mostly been burned down or torn apart as riots broke out across the country just a few years ago. One cold morning in September of 2021, a large group of powerful nations which had been convening in secret stood together and refused to accept the American dollar as a global trade currency. Before that, if a nation wanted to import products into their country, they first had to convert their currency into American dollars. If their currency was valued lower than the dollar, they could not import more products than they could afford to. The United States, because it already had utilized the dollar, could theoretically import as much product as they wanted to. All they had to do was print more dollars out to pay for it. By doing so, the value of the dollar slowly began to weaken, and other nations lost trust in it. Within the span of 24 hours, the dollar was no longer very valuable throughout the most of the world. And in order to counteract this, the Federal Reserve began to print trillions of dollars out in order to pay off the nation's debt. By the time the stock market closed that day, a loaf of bread cost nearly $600. Crime and riots broke out. Many lost their life savings, and some ended up taking their own lives. The United States of America entered into an incredibly dark period and began to crumble. Staring out the window, Ryder could see many of the old abandoned buildings that made up the bulk of the old city. Things began to turn around in the last few years. The genetics corporation that he worked for had created many new jobs. They built a corporate headquarters location in the heart of Chicago, and the area began to thrive once again. From the ashes, collapsed structures, and broken spirits, New Chicago was born. Ryder stepped out of the drifter and onto the cracked sidewalk in front of his apartment building. He approached the front entrance and waited as the security system scanned him from head to toe. The pressure-locked cylinders released, and he stepped inside of the building. His place was nothing to write home about, but he appreciated the security measures that had been installed. Many people around here were not very well off, and crime was an everyday part of life. As Ryder began to settle down, he remembered the data card in his pocket. He had intended to drop it off in the lost and found section at work, but had ended up becoming so busy that he forgot to do so before leaving. He spun it around in between his fingers. His curiosity got the best of him, and he synced it to his headset. He slipped the sleek, black headset over his face, like a pair of slightly large sunglasses. Inside were two screens, each capable of outputting 16K resolution at a solid 120 frames per second. The ends of the headset, near his ears, did not directly output sound waves, but rather used vibrations to simulate audio through his jawbone and inner ear. The headset was also able to create both an image and sound that were so close to reality, Ryder often could not tell the difference. The headset was capable of positional tracking and rotational tracking. He could look up or down, left or right, and it kept track of his movement instantaneously. He could lean in to look at things, stand up, sit down, crouch, and walk around, all while being tracked perfectly. He sat there, in his dark and mostly empty room, with no decorations to speak of. Inside the headset, he was somewhere else entirely. Inside of the headset, Ryder was sitting at a desk atop of a white, sandy beach. An endlessly reaching ocean lay ahead of him, and tall, healthy palm trees lined the landscape just beyond the beach's shore. The sounds of exotic wildlife could be heard behind him, and he was calmed by sounds of crashing waves just a few yards in front of him. This was where he felt at home. Sitting on top of his virtual desk was the same data card he had just synced to his headset. He reached out and picked it up. The headset used small micro cameras to track his hands almost perfectly. Although he could not feel the virtual data card inside of his fingers, he could hold it and move it around, just like one would in real life. He made a pinching-like gesture, and a number of folders appeared in front of him. He grabbed them and set them on the desk in a stack. Each folder had a labeled description on it, including its name and file size. The first folder read, Genetics Corporate Revenue Filings, First Quarter, 2029. Inside of the folder were nearly 100 files. He immediately felt a sense of wrongdoing by looking through the data. He closed the folder and sat for a few minutes. He reached out and made another gesture. A digital Rubik's Cube appeared on his desk. He picked it up and began to rotate the individual sides rapidly. 28 seconds later, the cube was complete and had 6 solid-colored sides. He tossed it towards the ocean, and it faded away in midair. Reaching back to the folders on his desk, he began to dive into the material and spent the next few hours going through the massive amount of data he had effectively stolen. At 3:34 a.m., he picked up the last folder. Stella Mortem, the label read. He attempted to open the folder, but it did not budge. There was no prompt for a password or any other method of accessing its contents. Perhaps the folder was corrupted. Ryder removed the headset, grabbed a beer from his refrigerator. Something about all of the files he had looked through left him feeling uneasy. This was the first chapter of Daydreamer, a new story by P.J. Chavez. Thank you for listening.